Okay, so Rita Nakashima Brock is the first Asian American woman to earn a doctorate in philosophy of religion and theology. She was born in Fukuoka, Japan, which is where my family resides. I didn't know that. I know, maybe we are related. People used to think we were the same person all the time when we go to meetings. Yeah, that happened a lot. She was raised in the US military. A scholar, educator, editor, and award-winning author, she has written several books, including Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire, and a number of other groundbreaking works in theology. A professor of religion, feminist studies, and Asian American studies for 28 years, Dr. Brock also directed the Bunting Radcliffe Institute Fellowship Program at Harvard University. She was a fellow at Harvard Divinity School Center for Values in Public Life. She's a recognized expert on moral injury. She co-founded the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School. And in 2017, she became Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Recovery Programs at Volunteers of America, which is a large social services nonprofit founded in 1896 by Maud and Ballington Booth. And she retired recently and now resides in Minneapolis. So I'd like to welcome Rita. Let's give her a nice warm welcome.
Technology. Thank you, Joan. It's always fun to have a friend introduce you. It is true. I don't know how many times we've been complimented for the other's presentation. Even when, like, one time she had hair down to the middle of her back and I had very short hair and she was wearing a dress and I was wearing a blue suit and they complimented her on my lecture. So I live in the Twin Cities metropolitan area of Minnesota. It's the Twin Cities because it's Minneapolis and St. Paul and the surrounding suburbs with a river in between us. And the Mississippi runs straight through between the two cities. They call us the Twin Cities. And like many areas of the United States, we continue to experience the lawless forces of the federal agency called Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with the acronym ICE. So I have my little button that says, in Minnesota, we love snow, but we hate ice. And the New York Times actually ran a story in the middle of this mess that talked about how Minnesota ICE was giving ICE a lot of trouble because lots of the people who were recently recruited into the organization have never experienced a Minnesota winter. So I bring you greetings from Minnesota, from the Springhouse Ministry Center in Minneapolis, which is near the site where the ICU nurse Alex Preddy was killed by ICE on January 24th. We've been a warming center since that happened for the resistors and protesters of his murder. And the Springhouse Ministry Center houses 3 churches in covenant with each other. We share one building together. And I bring you greetings from all 3. The First Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which is my congregation I go to, Lindale United Church of Christ, and Salem Lutheran Church. They bring greetings. They asked me to be sure to greet you all on their behalf. Also sending greetings are the Evangelical Church of America and the Unitarian Universalist Association and their president, Sophia Bedencourt. Finally, greetings from Faith in Minnesota, an interfaith network of religious leaders, and MARCH, M-A-R-C-H, Minnesota, which stands for Multi-Faith Anti-Racism Change and Healing. Many of these organizations were founded in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. when clergy in the area and organizations realized they needed to do better work on training protesters to be nonviolent and not destroy the city as they do their protesting. And so I think when they decided to send ICE into the Twin Cities area, they didn't understand that we had an infrastructure ready to go. So my clergy colleagues, I asked them if I had anything to say, if they had anything to say to you. And we have about 500 of them locally and 600 nationally that have been working in Minnesota. My clergy colleagues want you to know that the U.S. is deeply divided politically, as is the state of Minnesota itself, and many of our congregations as well. The latest Pew poll found that 57% of mainline Protestants support Trump. So many of us minister in divided churches. But please do not give up on us. We have been experiencing the very worst of humankind and the most beautiful in response to the invasion of our communities by lawless, masked ICE agents. Neighbors and communities in all their forms are holding, feeding, and loving one another in profound and simple ways as resistance, and we all know we're in this together. As I am leaning heavily on the concept of moral injury for this talk, let me begin with a definition of the term, since it's still relatively new. It only emerged in the US 15 years ago in relation to military veterans. It begins with an understanding that human biology builds the need for love and care into our very flesh, so that our first cry is a need for constant contact and care. Humans orient to being good, to receive the love needed to flourish, and we imprint on the behaviors of those closest to us to learn how to be moral, mostly as habit. In effect, we are born to be moral and to need love and to need it and to give it as desperately as we need food. Moral judgment emerges with brain maturation, language, and the formation of conscience. Moral conflict is an ordinary response of our conscience when something feels wrong. And it can be a minor thing, we apologize, or somebody apologizes to us. But it also can be a little bit deeper, like it's hard to know what was the right thing to do, or it's something that can't be fixed. And most of us learn to live with those things. We just sort of make it through, we do our best. Moral injury is when harm is at a level that it challenges our very core sense of who we are. You can imagine what war does to the people who have to fight it. That's why I think this concept emerged first in military veterans. And studies of American military veterans found that veterans themselves as a whole have a higher suicidality rate than the civilian population, but veterans who have killed in combat have double the veteran rate. That's how hard it is on people to do the things they're trained to do, even for good reasons. And I actually did a talk at one point with a group called the Hyacinth Group that is an international association of people who have killed someone by accident, like in a car crash. Even that, as simple as you didn't mean it, it's just bad luck, fate, even then people feel terrible. So moral injury is a real sign of how deeply moral we are. And so when the harm is profound, sustained, or systemic, because there are systems that oppress people, it can challenge our very sense of self and meaning and result in a spiritual crisis for individuals or institutions and even entire communities, as we are experiencing right now in the Twin Cities. Inflicting, failing to prevent, witnessing, inheriting, or being victimized by profound harm can result in moral injury feelings of outrage, aggrieved victim anger, despair, shame, remorse, disgust, hatred of self or other, and suicidality. Those are just a few of the consequences of experiencing profound harm. Historical legacies of moral injury that are unaddressed, just like trauma, can endure for generations. People in the cities across the US invaded by ICE agents have worked to form neighborhood organizations to face them down. With massive new funding from this horrible budget bill that got passed last year, ICE pays a bonus for every person an agent arrests. Not actual suspects or anyone who is not, or anyone who might actually be guilty of something. They pick up people who are not white or speak with an accent. I think you might be careful if you're a Brit in the US. They don't seem to understand we all have accents, but in any case, they pick up people they think have accents that don't fit in the United States. They arrest and abuse with impunity citizens, legal immigrants, and even Native Americans. We have quite a few of them in the Twin Cities, and they're being picked up too. Betrayed by their own federal government, ordinary people have channeled their moral outrage into protecting the vulnerable and trying to save as many people as possible. This too is moral injury, an intense moral impulse to prevent harm to others. On January 20th, 28 chiefs of police in the Twin Cities metro area, that's basically practically every city in the metro area, plus the head sheriff of Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is, had a press conference to complain about ICE, that ICE was making their jobs of keeping people safe and secure difficult, on top of which ICE was arresting off-duty police officers who are brown and black. That's how stupid they are. ICE entered the Twin Cities metro area in Minnesota in November, and an organized protest group immediately started trying to find the hotels they were staying in, and they would go over and make really loud noises during the night, so they couldn't sleep. So I don't know if that was why, but in January, ICE sent a surge of 2,000 agents into the Twin Cities as a show of force. It was like they wanted to show overwhelming force. Minneapolis only has 600 police officers. ICE sent 2,000 agents. They broke car windows, pulled people, even handicapped people from the cars and tossed them on the frozen street. They battered down the doors of residents, raided schools and college dormitories, randomly stopped people on the streets, at transit stops, and shopping in stores. They even pulled employees out of stores. They entered hospitals, sometimes chaining patients to their beds, and they even ate at restaurants and then went back and arrested the employees. The murder of 2 neighborhood observers, and observers are people who have been trained on how to use their phones and take evidence of ICE activities. Governor Walz, Tim Walz, who ran for vice president against J.D. Vance, Governor Walz, after all this started to happen, gave a speech. You can see it online if you want to see it. He urged Minnesotans to use their phones to document what ICE was doing. So the observers being trained are doing what the governor requested of us. So when Renee Good on January 6th and Alex Preddy on January 24th were murdered, it stirred moral outrage well beyond Minnesota. And in fact, Alice Preddy became an international story because it was so obvious they were lying about how he died. If you just look at the video, what they claimed is completely opposite of what happened. They are not the only people that ISIS killed, but the videos really revealed how much ICE was doing and how falsely they were representing people as terrorists. When the Department of Justice decided not to investigate Renee Good's murder, but to investigate her widow, 6 career attorneys with the Department of Justice in Minnesota all resigned rather than investigate her. Mistrust in the capacities of the FBI, ICE, and the Department of Justice to do an honest investigation is now profound. We can't trust justice in our own country. Most of the resistance in Minnesota by strategy is invisible. We don't have a Martin Luther King or a major person who's a figurehead who's representing. People are trying not to be identified. They don't want ICE to pick them up. So much of what's happening is being done on Signal, which is a high security app that our Secretary of Defense got in trouble for using because it was not supposed to. Anyway, that's another story. But Signal is where I'm already part of 8 groups on Signal. The scale of the resistance is astonishing. In Minneapolis, just one immigrant organization has trained at least 25,000 people in how to warn neighbors of ICE arrivals with whistles, and how to be observers and take videos to document ICE activity. We hand these out in church. Everybody I know in Minneapolis has a whistle now, because you never know where ICE is going to appear. A city, Minneapolis is maybe 450,000, less than 500,000 people. So one organization has already trained 24,000 people. And according to social scientists, in order to overthrow a bad government, you need a resistance movement that's at least 3.5% of the population, which is only in Minneapolis 15,000 people. So one organization has already trained 25,000 people. That tells you something about the scope of the resistance, and that's just one organization. Who knows how many people who haven't just watched a video on how to do it are doing it in their neighborhood quietly. We just don't know how many people. We know the official numbers of people who have volunteered to be trained, and these trainings keep going. There's one, some of these organizations are having them every week, but in any case, we want everybody in the city trained. Thousands of people are also involved in collecting food donations and delivering food to neighbors who are afraid to leave their homes. And there are a lot of people who are hiding in their homes, not because they're illegal, but they're just afraid of being picked up. Because ICE then started targeting white people carrying grocery bags, people had to memorize addresses instead of writing them down anywhere. We have a large Hmong, which is a Cambodian group, a large Hmong neighborhood in St. Paul called Frogtown, which on its Signal app has 1,000 volunteers or more a day that patrol the streets and look for ICE. Schools across the metro area went back online because ICE was raiding them. Across the US, coalitions have been created by cities invaded by ICE to offer strategies for resistance whenever it arrives in a new location. And Chicago especially was helpful to us in Minneapolis. January 23rd was declared by all these organizations doing resistance work a general strike day in Minnesota. No work, no school, no shopping. It was supported, the strike day was supported by the AFL-CIO, which represents 1,000 unions, 700 local businesses, 23 other unions, most of the major museums, plus schools, libraries, and hundreds of community organizations, which were closed for the day. And even in businesses where people did go to work, they were often given permission not to come to work or to go to the big march in the afternoon. On the morning of that strike day, in minus 28 Celsius weather, hundreds of clergy and striking airport workers closed the Minneapolis airport. It is the largest in the upper Midwest, where daily 100 people in shackles are flown away from their homes and families. 98 of the clergy specifically volunteered to be arrested that morning on purpose to be a visible moral symbol of the vast resistance. Then, in the afternoon, 50,000 people marched in downtown Minneapolis in the same weather. So, the very next morning, after that jubilant march, but people were so thrilled with so many people, ICE murdered a nurse, Alex Preddy, and set off a massive national and international response. The Minneapolis Emergency Management Director, Rachel Sayer, said this that morning. My background is in international humanitarian response in conflict zones in Yemen, Haiti, Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine. What I've seen here is what I've seen there. A powerful entity violently and intentionally terrorizing people, making them afraid to go outside so they can't earn a living, so kids are forced out of school. This has a lasting generational impact. People can't plan a single day of their lives because they don't know who was around the corner and if their family member or neighbor is about to be taken away. In these times, you see both the best and the worst. The worst is the terror and the feeling of helplessness. The best will continue to be our community's response, the way we are showing up for each other. We're showing up for each other in the absolute worst of times. The murder of Alex Preddy resulted in the removal of the man who orchestrated the strategy of overwhelming force and increasing pressure on Congress to shut down funding for ICE. And in fact, the Democrats threatened not to pass a budget, so the federal government was going to shut down. They took ICE out of the budget, so now they're going to negotiate about the funding for ICE. We would just like them to disband the organization. For now, in the old budget bill, they have 3 years of funding. So I don't know what's going to happen to ICE, but at least they're going to talk about it. But for us in Minnesota, not much has changed. The new head hasn't fixed it. And this past Friday, there was a national strike day against ICE. The Trump administration, I think, was so severely impacted negatively by what ICE has been doing and its crimes that on Friday, the day of the national strike, it suddenly, hastily and sloppily released 3 million Epstein files to wipe ICE out of the news cycle. Now the British news is all about Epstein again. What's interesting is, I think that some of the stuff this is sort of moved, done with ICE was to keep the Epstein files out of the news cycle, but now it's better that it be there than ICE. That's how bad ICE has become for them. The poll numbers have been going down as more stories about ICE have been in the news. Chilling parallels have been drawn between ICE and the Nazi brown shirts. Like there are two, in the Nazi era, there were sort of two societies simultaneously, sort of with a firewall between them, where you had the brown shirts who were the takeover government, and then you had people just going into their jobs in ordinary ways and not noticing. And I think the film The Zone of Interest is about that. This is the one where this family with their garden live right next door to Auschwitz. If you have not seen that movie, it's really chilling. But so people have been drawing that parallel that the ICE, most people in white suburbs and in affluent places aren't seeing ICE. But a whole bunch of people are being devastated by it. But I actually don't think we need that parallel. U.S. history has its own models. European colonizers stole the land, murdered indigenous people, confined survivors on reservations, and kidnapped their children, putting them in boarding schools to scrub their language and culture from them. They used slaves and slave hunters to protect their assets and founded a republic with a constitution that inscribed slavery, left out women, and still favors the historic slave-owning states. That's what the Electoral College is, that elects the president, not the popular vote. After the Civil War, the defeated slave-owning states created civilian militias to terrorize freed black human beings and lynch them as public spectacles attended by families dressed as if they were at a festival. Schools would close so kids could go watch a lynching. In World War II, the citizenship of native-born and naturalized citizens was revoked, and thousands of people were imprisoned in concentration camps on suspicion of their Japanese ancestry. For the people whose ancestors, grandparents, and parents struggled for women's rights, racial equality, LGBTQI rights, living wages and safe work environments, indigenous rights and sovereignty, and justice for all, what is happening in Minnesota is not unprecedented. We don't need to turn to Germany today for parallels to what is happening to us. It's in our own history. It may be new to those who never had to fight for those rights, but it's not new to a lot of us. So, to those who are sitting out the current struggle, the team chaplain for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, this is a really interesting thing that happened. The team chaplain for this national basketball team housed in the Twin Cities issued this statement for the strike day. If you're a church posting prayers for peace and unity today while my city bleeds in the street, don't dress avoidance up as holiness. Don't call silence peacemaking. Peace isn't what you ask for when the boot is already on someone's neck. Peace is what the powerful ask for when they don't want to be interrupted. Unity isn't neutral. Unity that refuses to name violence is just loyalty to the ones holding the weapons. Stop using scripture like chloroform. Stop calling your fear wisdom. Stop pretending Jesus was crucified because he preached good vibes and personal growth. You don't get to quote scripture like a lullaby while injustice stays wide awake. You don't get to ask God to heal the land if you won't even look at the wound. There is a kind of peace that only exists because it refuses to tell the truth. That peace is a lie, and lies don't grow anything worth saving. The scriptures you love weren't written to keep things calm. They were written to set things right. And sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is stop praying around the pain and start standing inside it. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Growth always is. He really did say that. Snopes, I checked to make sure, because it was all over social media, and I thought, what is the chaplain of a basketball team? But he has black players. Of all U.S. states, why Minnesota, you might ask? Minnesota is just a mid-sized state with an evenly divided legislature. We actually have a 50-50 split in our legislature right now. While per capita, we have a larger share of Fortune 500 companies and a lower percentage of immigrants than many other states, we also have many organizations that work to welcome and settle immigrants in the state. A Republican presidential candidate has not won the state in 50 years. In 1942, Macalester College in St. Paul invited Japanese American students to attend while their families were put in concentration camps during the war. There is an old Japanese American community in the Twin Cities from that time, and a Japanese American Citizens League chapter. We have a large number of Korean adoptees, and the Hmong community is the largest in the US, and it all came mostly after the Vietnam War because they fought for the US in Vietnam. St. Paul just elected its first Hmong mayor, Cully Vang Her, and she's got an all-female city council. The Somali community is the largest outside of Somalia and has a member in Congress, Ilhan Omar, who was recently attacked by a Trump reporter at a town hall meeting because she's a critic of Trump. Minnesota is one of the few states I can imagine in which a progressive, middle-class Jewish college professor named Paul Wellstone could decide to run for the U.S. Senate, have students help him make his campaign messages because he had no money. He had 1/10 the war chest of the incumbent that he was running against, and he won. I don't know many states where that's possible. Maybe the small states like Vermont or Maine, but not any of the large states. It takes so much money now to get elected to Congress. Minneapolis has the largest urban Native American population in the U.S., and weather is so dangerous for 3 or 4 months a year that neighbors are just used to helping each other without a second thought. I don't own a snowblower, and anytime my neighbor sees me out trying to shovel my driveway, he drives it right over and helps me. Just Minnesotans are like that. On the strike day, I was one of those 98 Minnesota clergy who got arrested. It's not my first arrest, but it was the nicest arrest I had. Because it was Minnesota, at the airport, by the airport police. After nearly 2 hours on the heated buses, as we all were booked at the headquarters, and the airport police department is rather small, the officer on the bus with us asked us to pass our handcuffs that are plastic, the little plastic handcuffs. He just asked people to take them off and send them forward because they weren't really attached tight or anything. So pretty soon, as the handcuffs accumulated moving forward, he had a whole bundle of these plastic handcuffs. And somebody asked, "Are they going to be recycled?" The officer shook his head and said, "That is such a Minnesota question." That moment of attention to climate change brings me to the larger question of what the events in Minnesota and the current disasters befalling the U.S. Republic might mean in a long view of history as we face into the realities of climate change and the demise of fossil-fueled civilization. Luke Kemp's book, he's here in Cambridge, Luke Kemp's book, Goliath's Curse, A History and Future of Societal Collapse, is a sweeping and sobering 5 millennia global analysis of the collapse of 300 empires. So he does South America, the whole temperate zone of the globe, where these empires emerged after the Ice Age. It's an interesting sequel to some extent to the work of Gerda Lerner on the creation of patriarchy. However, instead of the rise of empires, Kemp examines risk factors leading to their inevitable demises. They all collapsed. In terms of human evolution, empires are late, arriving at the end of the Ice Age and with the development of settled agriculture, abundant harvests near great rivers that were fed by melting glaciers. Empires emerged with surplus that needed settlements to control its distribution, the extraction of assets, and wealth accumulation. He describes the kings, lords, or emperors of these civilizations as serial killers possessed of a dark triad of traits: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. That would describe our president right now. Colonization offloaded the environmental limits and costs of extracting natural resources and allowed empires to sustain the assets needed to maintain their power. But empires still eventually failed, and I'd say rather spectacularly in the last century with 2 world wars. Kemp identifies multiple factors in the inevitable collapse of empires after a few centuries. Few lasted beyond 400 years. So these are the factors that are a lethal increase in authoritarianism, which is violence used to control assets and people; exploitation, bloated, brittle bureaucracies with too much power at the top; corruption, which is feckless, incompetent criminal rulers; internal power struggles, revolts by elites and uprisings of the exploited classes, often involving messianic movements and apocalypticism. 5, environmental destruction. Agricultural failures from drought, deforestation, desertification, asset depletion, natural disasters, and climate change. 6, loss of populations. Migration, sometimes people just left as a mass exodus, or famine. Wars, these are all depletions of population. Wars, diseases and pandemics. And finally, 7, wars, invasions, and colonization. We are now living in fossil-fueled multinational capitalist empires that depend on constant growth, and they are environmentally, we know, unsustainable. AI is adding to that unsustainability by the amount of electricity it's using. There's now even talk of creating mini nuclear reactors so that AI can have the energy it needs. I don't know how they're going to do that, but anyway, there's talk of that. In addition, the birth rate, especially now in industrialized countries, has dropped precipitously to well below replacement rates. One estimate is if we keep reproducing at the current rate, we'll be extinct in about 300 years. So we aren't reproducing at a replacement, even at a basic replacement rate. And I think South Korea has the worst rate, along with China, which is like maybe 0.7 children per couple. We need 2.1 at a replacement rate. Capitalism depends on a growing population. The whole energy of capitalism is growth and more money. So the birth rate isn't helping. It's probably good for the environment, though. In the meantime, in fact, the only place, this was a study I read, where the people are reproducing at above a replacement rate are a few areas, mostly in Africa, where there are no cell phones. Maybe that's a cipher for technology and development, but it's interesting. So in the meantime, we must find ways to prevent both nuclear war and a collapse of the ecosystem that supports human life on the earth. Throughout the rise of empires, ideology, what we in the West call religion, has been a handmaid of empire. We see it now in the US with white Christian nationalism. Monotheism in various forms emerged in the second millennium BCE in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Persia, hand in glove with powerful empires, which asserted mandates from invisible systems of power, making gods in the image of monarchical power, at the same time relativizing material reality. Imperial religious ideas traveled for millennia on trade routes that stretched from the Atlantic east to the Pacific, on the land and sea routes that we now call the Silk Road. So what we think of as separate religions are hybrids of all of that trading and the influences are profound. For example, Persian Zoroastrianism is probably the origin of the idea of heaven and hell. So they're just things that emerge, and Christianity is a hodgepodge of some of these ideas that were crossing in the Silk Road. So this idea that somehow we have these pure encapsulated faiths that are truths is not a good read of history. In fact, in the first millennium CE, so right the millennium after the birth of Jesus, that millennium, there were more Christians in Asia than there were in Europe. That's how much the stuff was spreading. And Buddhism and Christianity especially tended to be missionizing religions. The Emperor Ashoka sent missionaries out to the rest of Asia to convert everybody to Buddhism. And Christians were busy doing that, and then Islam as well. So there's also this impulse of missionizing religions. So Western scholars of religion in the last century assumed monotheism evolved as a more advanced and civilized religion than the group-oriented collectivist hunter-gatherer societies, which were deemed primitive, polytheistic, or animist because they understood power inherent in material and experiential reality. We have knowledge of imperial ideologies, and we don't know what those hunter-gatherer societies actually believed or taught because they didn't write things down. So we have knowledge of imperial ideologies because writing was invented to track and monitor assets and trade arrangements. It was also used to record stories of the powerful and their systems of power, both human and divine. It is certainly no accident that imperial power could be envisioned as serving one or more ultimate and powerful invisible entities as the source of life, who sanction an earthly stand-in responsible for maintaining the empire and its protection systems. Karl Jaspers in the last century coined the term axial age for the first millennium BCE, when kings were challenged by oracles and prophets for their oppressive practices and their wars, and the ideal of the sovereign individual emerged, as also for ordinary people, in the sense of the individual, not just the king. The Hebrew classical prophets, of course, were critical of kings and their excesses, and they warned of imperial collapse and offered hope in a divinely anointed monarch who cared for the oppressed and dispossessed enough to usher in a benevolent era of peace and justice. Or a savior who ushered in a new reign in the aftermath of collapse. So even though they were protesting imperial systems, they didn't have another way to think about a system for human beings except a better empire. a more benevolent empire. This hope in a charismatic savior who would usher in Christian rule is one aspect of white Christian nationalism in the U.S. After 9/11, the eruption of Christian anti-Muslim hostilities and fears of Sharia law being imposed were propagated by forms of Christianity that wanted a Christian nation with the Ten Commandments in the schools and federal buildings. So these were, they projected onto Islam what they wanted for Christianity and saw Islam as the enemy. Christian ideas of a redeemed future with a new heaven and earth drove colonization to North America. The city on the hill, the new world, all of those theologies drove the colonization of the Americas, especially Protestant America in the north. The original impetus for the War of Independence was an attempt to escape an existing empire to form a republic that protected elite white men's assets, including land slavery and patriarchy. Jill Lepore's monumental history of the U.S., These Truths, is the first ever written by a woman. She's a feminist. She suggests from original documents, because she's a professor of endowed chair history at Harvard, so she does her homework. So from original early documents, she suggests that the War of Independence was partly motivated by a desire to maintain slavery when it looked like England might outlaw it. It wasn't about taxes and tea. I want to suggest that white Christian nationalism is grounded in a medieval theology of salvation that understands state violence as an instrument of salvation. The idea that an omnipotent God was so insulted by sinful humanity that he, I emphasize he, required an only son identical to himself to be born human to redeem the world from the punishing consequences of divine wrath by enduring an excruciating, torturous death on our behalf was necessary. This was written book by Anselm in 1198, and the title of it was Why God Became Human, and the point of the book is to say it in order to die. The book never mentions resurrection. So the goal of Jesus was to come to die as the Christ, to save humanity from the wrath of God. His near contemporary, Peter of Abelard, asked what I think is a salient question: who will forgive God for killing his own son? Imperial religions, this trajectory of that theology runs right through Christian nationalism. It's called atonement theology. There are two versions of it, but it's basically an understanding that it's the death of Jesus that delivers salvation. And when this theology emerged in Western Christianity, you start to get these really gory, bloody depictions, horrifying depictions of Jesus dying so that you could see your salvation. I discovered by accident many years ago, over a decade ago, that with my friend Rebecca Parker, we write books together, that there isn't an image. This is what puzzled us, which set us off on a whole journey about theology. There is not an image of Jesus dead on the cross for a millennium in Christian churches. They never showed him like that. If they showed him on the cross, he was alive, sometimes even had a robe of purple nobility or glory. If he was on the cross, it was not to die. But mostly they just didn't show him that way. One of my favorite images from the early first millennium is about 6th century. It's in a church in Ravenna, Italy. Anybody here been to Ravenna and seen those? They're amazing images, aren't they? This is an image of Jesus in a church called San Vitale, which is Orthodox shape. It's not a basilica shape. It's octagonal. And the chancel is very tall and it's huge. And right in the middle, high up, Jesus is sitting with a golden sky behind him. I think it's a resurrection Easter sky. And he's sitting on a big blue globe of the earth. That's his throne, is the earth. And he's wearing just a simple purple robe. He's got barefoot in sandals, and he looks about 15. He looks young, almost like a boy, teenager, because he doesn't have a beard. He's not a Roman man with a beard and all that. And he is flanked by 2 angels, and then the bishop and, dignitaries. But the thing that's fascinating about that image is the globe sits on a little hill. It's like a little mesa. The globe sits on a mesa, and coming off that mesa are 4 rivers. So where have we heard of 4 rivers? Genesis. The Gihon, the Pishon, the Tigris, Euphrates are the rivers that flow from paradise. Great river of paradise splits into those 4 rivers. Jesus is sitting on a mesa. 4 rivers are flowing out onto green meadows with flowers. This really beautiful image of him on the globe. What we discovered was, as we went all around Rome to our first millennium churches, is that iconography of the paradise rivers is everywhere. So when I first discovered that, I thought, oh, geez, Christianity's been accused of being a death cult. And this, maybe this is the afterlife they're depicting for people. No, that wasn't the theology at all. They actually believe what Genesis said. Genesis said that paradise is on the earth. It doesn't say it's the afterlife. That was later, after the atonement theology emerged, and you got to go to paradise as a reward for killing for Christ, because it was an ideology for the Crusades. But in the early church, one of my favorite quotes is the Bishop Irenaeus in Lyon, who was martyred, and the bishop before him was also martyred. He said, the church is planted as the paradise in this world. So that is the mission of the church, is to be a place for human thriving in a world that might persecute you, kill you, but the church is to be that place of human goodness and thriving. And you see this iconography in chancels of churches. Now, but you have to know, you have to tune up your vision, because so often we don't see what's there. We see what we think is there. So I showed that image in a talk years ago with some theologians, and one of them was a religion and art professor. And he said, have you read any art historians or people who talk about those 4 rivers in that image of Jesus on the globe? And it's a very famous image, so it's widely used. I said, no. I said, we can't find anybody who even makes much of this iconography of Genesis that's all over the early churches. Do you know? He said, no. He said, I don't know anyone that has. And I said, oh. He said, but I've looked at that image hundreds of times and never noticed the rivers. Because they aren't seen as important, you don't notice them. But the rivers are everywhere in early Christian art. So what we discovered in that process was they didn't think of Jesus' death as salvation. They thought his resurrection was a confirmation of the ministry he had lived. So the work of the church as the paradise in this world was to feed the hungry, heal the sick, teach the ignorant, and care for each other. That was the mission of the church. And that Jesus taught them that Jesus, as the Christ, lived that out. And the Romans killed him. It was really tragic and awful, but he came back to us. And every saint in the church comes back at every Eucharist. And so they depicted the saints in glory on the walls of their churches. They depicted Jesus, Paradise Garden, that is the iconography for almost a millennium in early Christianity all over Europe and North Africa. That's a very different understanding of Christianity, and I think it's truer to the gospel, where Jesus baptized in the river and then immediately forms a community. And that's what keeps it going. That's what remembers him, brings him back with their love and prayers. He's not a king. He's not royalty. He's a simple peasant, a Jewish peasant from northern Israel, so he wasn't attached much to the temple. The temple was a sign of imperial authority. In fact, all four Gospels have some kind of condemnation of that imperial system. So that's a very different understanding of Christianity as Christ the King. And there are images of Jesus on a throne in early Christian art, but as a Princeton art historian pointed out, people think it's imperial, like he's like the emperor, but the emperor never sat on a back throne. The emperor sat on a stool with crossed legs underneath, and Jesus never sits on a stool like that. He's always in a throne, and who sits in a throne? Well, Jupiter or some god. So the divinity of Jesus is affirmed in that throne image, but he's not actually a parallel to the emperor. He actually outranks the emperor in those images. So, I think we need the kind of Christianity that understands that when change happens, it's because thousands of people are involved, not because a savior does it for us. A savior might inspire us. We are all in the Twin Cities inspired by the loss of Renee Good. We want to make Renee Good and Alec Preddy's lives mean something because they were doing what observers do, which was to try to protect and love their neighbor. I'm going to skip some of this. Somehow I got way back into it. All right. So I think an as it were, anti-imperial or resistant to imperial form of Christianity is what we need. It's the counter to Christian white nationalism, which sees, I think, Trump as their savior. And I actually, I'm getting to the moral injury part of this. I believe that Trump's power is moral injury. It's aggrieved victim anger, which he exudes. That is the kind of emotional magnet he is. And it's, I think, no accident that militant Christianity was blatantly obvious at the January insurrection after he lost the election. And the now successful backlash to democracy began actually in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, when the rich paid 95% in taxes. They now pay somewhere like 30 to 40. The increasingly lower tax rates for the rich allowed wealth to increase and to be held in obscene amounts by the few. What happened is that the UN scale of inequality indicates that it is now rising in 90% of all countries, with the US rate ranking well above the countries in Europe and Japan and Canada. We no longer have a thriving middle class in the United States. College is pretty much unaffordable for middle class folks. Trump's base is populated by men whose expectations for a decent life, with a life purpose of value to others and prospects for work that can support long-term family relationships, they're just not in those places. Manufacturing has disappeared, good union jobs disappeared. And so to feel thwarted and trapped by circumstances beyond your control, with no avenues for moving forward and unable to feel dignity or social value for others, can lead people to despair, frustration, fury, substance use, or violence against self or others. It can also lead to fixating on a messianic savior figure who says he's the only one who can destroy or fix a system that oppresses them. Philosopher Joseph Winnicott Leiden, who's an expert on moral injury, studies hate groups for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he has concluded that moral injury is their driving energy. As a friend observed, white male privilege and the expectations it teaches causes moral injury in the current trickle-up economics begun during the Reagan years. As long as we cling to a need for saviors to save us, we will still be trying, in the words of African-American writer Audre Lorde, to dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. In the face of imperialism, the idea of democracy has been infectious, and the last 2.5 centuries of struggle internally and globally in the U.S. to create more democracy has given voice and power, however imperfectly, to entire populations long exploited and oppressed by empires. Kemp, in identifying what enabled human survival after the fall of empires, discusses revolt or abandonment, but the collapses, if they do collapse, cost untold deaths and often left degraded environments that had to be abandoned. The wild card of hope for Kemp, though, that he thinks might help us prevent a total collapse of fossil fuel civilization is democracy. As just flat out lots and lots of people working and voting and doing the right thing. If the U.S. survives the next 3 years, we will have to address how fragile our democracy actually is, how easy it was for a criminal without shame or respect for the law and its institutions to ignore, violate, and disrupt our 3 branches of government. In just 1 year, ICE has violated 4 of the amendments to the Constitution. I have found that knowing some history offers me hope that saving and improving our democracy is possible. We did, after all, manage to recover from a terrible civil war, somewhat, but I hope also for a different kind of post-colonial, democracy-based Christianity. If we believe that even our enemies are born moral and can be reached, that process has to begin with respect, real listening, and sometimes getting out of the way if we don't feel safe or productive in those contexts. Aggrieved victim anger can be transformed by people who are trusted not to judge and who are willing to listen empathetically to shame, sense of failure and helplessness, loneliness, and grief underneath the fury and frustration that cover them. This is not to say we should start taking care of adherents to fascism. Understanding the limits of our abilities to engage them is a reason to work elsewhere on coalitions and positive solutions rather than focusing energy on how terrible they are. There's tons of that. But many clergy and some of my friends have MAGA-identified people in their lives and congregations. And if we are wiser in how we treat them and the things that concern them, we might be able to engage them in ways that enable them not to hold so tightly to their pain and enthrallment with MAGA. In forming interpersonal connections with courage, tenacity, honesty, solidarity, non-dogmatic, innovative approaches to problem solving, and respectful, empathetic openness when it is possible, we might more wisely address moral injury and keep living out the collective work that resists and undermines empires. But to do that means, I suggest, deconstructing imperial monotheism in any form, whether goddess or god, re-enchanting material life, and understanding the wisdom of reality's interconnectedness as spiritual truth. I'm going to stop there. I'm at 5 minutes over, but I'm going to stop there. I apologize. It was a bit of a hodgepodge of a paper because I had one, and then all that stuff happened in Minneapolis, and I had to add that, and then I kept changing what I wanted to say. So it's a hodgepodge. I agree with that.
Thank you, Rita.
Yeah.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. So we have time now for questions, and I've got a mic if anyone would like to engage.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I really appreciated that. I just had a sort of question about resistance more broadly, because I know that 3 years until the next election is a long time for someone like Trump to cause a lot of chaos. And so I had a few questions. One about whether you think the Americans, the left-wing Americans, need to utilize their right to the Second Amendment as well. And whether you think that maybe some form of, not necessarily explicitly violent revolution, but some form of more aggressive and forthright resistance to the fascist regime might be necessary. And yeah, because I wonder whether the Civil War, as you mentioned, was only won through fighting, and the collapse of American empire may well only come through revolution rather than elections. So I wonder what
No, those are excellent questions. We in Minnesota actually considered that we might be the site of the start of a civil war, partly because the governor normally runs a National Guard, and the president can deploy the National Guard for certain purposes. The governor asked the National Guard to go in after Alex Preddy died to secure the area for an investigation because ICE was wrecking it, and the protesters were also in there, and it was a mess. So he sent in the National Guard. The protesters weren't exactly violent. I mean, they weren't attacking ICE agents, but they weren't, they were yelling and other things. And there was tear gas and all that. So he sent in the National Guard, and the National Guard arrived and secured the area, and then started passing out hot chocolate and coffee and donuts to the protesters. This is the National Guard. So there was a standby order, a be ready order that went to an Army unit of 1,500 troops in Alaska, which they're cold trained. So if Trump had chosen, which he threatened to do, to invoke the Insurrection Act, we didn't know what the National Guard would do, because he could also deploy them. But would they refuse and defend Minnesotans, or would they join the forces of the Army to put us down? We didn't know what was going to happen at that for a couple of days. But then that's when he fired the head of the ICE unit there, and replaced him with someone else. It hasn't changed a whole lot, but that meant he had sort of backed down. The Second Amendment, this is one of those strange ironies of history. Most of us don't think we have too many guns and we shouldn't have such loose gun laws. But Alex Preddy had a gun. He was a legal gun owner, and it was in his belt behind him. And they used that as an excuse to say he was a terrorist and he had loaded magazine. He was going to kill everybody in ICE. He never withdrew the gun. He didn't reach for it. It was just they took it away from him before they shot him. So he was unarmed when they shot him. But the head of the FBI said he brought it on himself by having the gun at all, and that it's illegal to take a gun and fully loaded magazines to a protest action, which is exactly wrong. The FBI director is an idiot and doesn't even know the laws. So now gun owners are mad I don't know what that means. I really don't know what that means, but it's an odd, strange bedfellows moment where gun owners are now maybe rethinking, some of them, their loyalty to MAGA, because MAGA had been defending their right to carry those guns to protest actions. I have no idea how that's going to sort itself out. At least in Minnesota, I don't think anybody's planning any kind of armed insurrection or anything like that. We understand the risks of that because the US military is still pretty powerful and awful when it's deployed. But that's another question. Would the military actually attack its own citizens? It's not supposed to be doing internal things, it's to defend the borders. But so you're right, it's a really crazy time. I think a lot of us are putting our hopes in the midterm elections next year. Is it next year? This year? This year. I've lost track of time. It's this November, and his approval ratings have steadily gone down. And it dropped below 40% due to, right after the murder of Alex Preddy. So, you know, we're all really heartened by what happened in New York with Zoran Mandami, because he's I hope, the face of the new Democratic Party, because the old guard is hanging on but not doing nearly enough. And Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I mean, there's some good talent coming up in the Democratic Party. If we really get lucky, we could get a 60-vote majority in the Senate, and we could impeach and remove Trump if the House was majority Democrat. And it's only 4 votes right now. So if the polls are accurate, if the elections go our way, we could put some brakes on what's going on. But it's just we're going to have to hang on for 3 years somehow.
Hi, this is a sort of smaller point. Thank you so much. You've given us such a lot to think about. Alex Preddy and Rene Good were both white, and I understand that there were people of color who'd been shot by ICE before, but this never made the headlines. Does that kind of show the ongoing racism of all us media folk and people who read the papers, or was there something different about Rene Good and Alex Preddy?
Well, I think racism is a factor in the attention paid to their murders, but it's also, there was clear video. There was a Latinx man whose name just fell out of my head in LA who was also murdered by ICE, and they killed number of people in detention centers, but nobody's filming any of that. They just report the deaths. I think when you have a face in a video, it matters. It's also, I think, shocking to people that they would kill white people, right? So, because we have a history of brown and black people dying, or being killed. So I do think there's a racism factor, but it's also the case that both of them, and I think this should be honored, they were allies. They were good allies. They were trying to protect their neighbors of color, and they died for it. And I think that also should be remembered. And it's okay to be sad that they're dead. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask whether there was any bridge building with the Christian white nationalists. And the Christian white nationalists, you were talking about how they are a core constituency of MAGA. I'm just wondering whether the lines are so hard now that any dialogue is not possible. Is there any bridge building in that space, or it's just war?
I think the best people, the question is the MAGA people's religious convictions are so hard baked in that is it possible to change them? I think there are people who have come out, as it were, who were changed, they're the best people to go back in. They understand that world and that space. And there are, I know there have been people identified by reporters and people who are trying to do that work. So I'm not the person who I came to the United States at the age of 6 from a Japanese Buddhist family, and I found Christianity very strange. And I found it very strange until I went to college, and then I started reading about the history and the historical Jesus and all that, and that he was a fighter for justice. I thought, oh, well, I could get behind that. But I was also subjected to racism, and so by white Christians, and I had to spend every August from 1st to 6th grade, and then a year in 7th grade in Amory, Mississippi, where my stepfather was from. Every August we went to help his brother-in-law bring in his cotton crop, and I was in 7th grade the only non-white person in the junior high. And that brand of Christianity that I encountered there I couldn't figure out what it was. It didn't make any sense to me. It seemed so strange. So I was actually baptized as 18 in high school as my senior year because this Baptist minister's daughter was my best friend, and I wanted to belong to the community. But I didn't know what saying Jesus was my personal Lord and Savior meant. And I still don't know what it means. Exactly. I'm not that kind of a believer, as it were. My sense of being Christian is belonging to a historical legacy that I find worth belonging to and a community of value to me. So I'm not a minister of a church, I'm a chaplain. I like being able to receive people, whatever their religion is, and give spiritual care.
Hi.
Hi.
That was fantastic. Thanks so much. Lots of food for thought. I was just thinking about our situation in the UK at the moment, and I guess this is going to sound like a long, winding question, but I guess given the point that you're at, like there's a crisis point in Minnesota, which is just really evident, and there are like sprinklings of that here at the moment. Like there's, increasing immigration enforcement in the UK, targeting specifically businesses like hairdressers, nail salons, and people being detained, honestly, not dissimilarly. I don't feel like we're as aware of it here as we are of the stuff in America, which is kind of interesting. And it's kind of being, I guess, peddled by the government as like, this is a sort of take back of, something. It's hard to, and also that there was a march by UKIP yesterday through near here, at Marble Arch, and what you were saying about the kind of medieval theology really rings true because, I don't know, when we've been hearing people on the trains talking about wanting a ninth crusade, for why? Thinking, I guess I'm thinking about how do we bridge build at this point in which maybe we're not yet at a crisis, but sort of, it feels like we're approaching it. And I know me and some of my friends are not really knowing how we build solidarity across religious networks and churches, and sort of use our faith. I don't like using the word use, but how we kind of navigate through our faith and use that as a way of communicating with people about the things that really matter, in a way that might be a bit more fruitful. And I guess, given your sort of experience, what you would sort of recommend at this point?
I don't know if I'm the person to ask that to. I do have family that are, I think, MAGA. I was just at a cousin's funeral in Mississippi, and I didn't know this, but the neighbor on one side of me in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, he sold his house and left, and we got leftover mail, or mail delivered to the wrong address. And one of them was an envelope that was photos of the inauguration of Trump. So they were Trump support, but I didn't know that. We were just good neighbors. And I think I don't know that I would have ever started a political conversation with them, but I put a Harris Waltz sign on my front yard, so they knew I was not a supporter of Trump, but somehow we managed to be good neighbors. That maybe this is just a trait of Minnesotans, that we are like that some of the time. But had I known that and they had stayed, I would have made an effort to get to know them better, because I liked them. They were very good neighbors. And it's probably true a number of people. I live in a white suburb mostly, and there are probably a number of neighbors that are Trump supporters. And that I'm not going to start harping on, I mean, I just think staying connected to people when you can, so that they don't demonize you. Like, I don't feel like my neighbors think I'm a bad person or something. They all know I'm a Democrat because I had a public sign in my yard. But they don't. But they're, the guy with the snowblower comes over when I don't get. I have high school kids I hire to remove snow, but sometimes they're slow to do it. And so and one time I had to get out and it was really bad. And he just came over, blew the snow off my driveway. But I think you don't want to start with an argument or with contempt for somebody because they don't agree with you. It's just not helpful. I don't respond well to that. So I think part of it is just treating people the way you'd like to be treated yourself by people who don't agree with you. But there are people I know who just are good at that. I'm not. I start to get nervous because I'm not white, for one thing, and I don't know why they're talking to me, and so I have to sort of figure that out. But I do think it's true that there are lots of wonderful memes on social media that make fun of people who are MAGA and all, and some of that is fun to do, the cartoonists, etc. But on a person-to-person basis, I think that kind of humor and contempt isn't helpful. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. From my perspective, one of the driving forces behind MAGA is a fear of the white not being in majority, therefore they're going to suffer. And you ask, why are they so afraid? And Barack Obama didn't, there was like a narrative of the blacks are going to seek retribution from the whites, which is not going to happen. There's not enough of us to do retribution on the whites. But how do you deal with a fear? It's probably irrational, but how do you deal with the fear? Because if you got rid of that fear, a lot of the driving force behind their way of thinking and their politics would lessen greatly.
I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I know what you mean. I think it varies by race, right? So there's stereotypes for, like, Asian Americans get a different profile racially. In California, they decided to count us as white because Asian Americans overpopulate the universities in California proportionate to our numbers. And so they didn't want to count Asians in affirmative action and just lump us with white people because they didn't want to privilege more Asian Americans and so we're sort of used as a model minority against other people of color, and so we get treated somewhat differently than being black. Latinx varies depending on how dark you are, I think, and same with Native American. And in Minnesota, there's a lot of racism with Native Americans because they're actually there as people. They're not some myth of a disappeared race, as it is in some parts of the U.S. But yeah, no, it's a conundrum, isn't it? that people are instantly afraid of, especially black men. At least in the U.S., that's a common thing. Like, there are cab drivers in New York that won't pick up black men, for example. Things like that. Even with the president that we had. But I think, in fact, a lot of us celebrated the election of Barack Obama because it felt like it was a watershed moment in American history. But I think to the MAGA crowd, he was the celebration at their expense. That people that shouldn't be doing as well as they are doing better. I mean, there's an assumption about white privilege there, and male privilege as well. But yeah, it just takes what I know is that being in a community that's different from your own and actually living on a day-to-day basis is the only way to really do personal transformation. I spent a year and a half before I got fired for insubordination. I spent a year and a half teaching at a black college, and that really changed my automatic body reactions, because I had these big, tall black students that would be mad because they didn't get the grade it's like, hey, I'm the professor. But I liked them. I liked them a great deal. They were great students. And then I spent 7 years in the 90s. I'm in Minnesota for the second time. I taught there for 7 years at Hamline University. And I've been in Minnesota before. And the 7 years I lived there before, I was a member of one of the first predominantly LGBTQI churches in the Twin Cities. It was UCC, called Spirit of the Lakes. They called a group of us the Token Hets. But being in a community with people who were gender diverse, as it were, and their identities, helped me really relax around it and just be and get the jokes and be in the culture in a way that I was an advocate for their rights, but I wasn't someone who really understood those communities. After 7 years, it's great. It's all right. So it's also partly people taking responsibility for difference and getting comfortable with it. And churches can provide those experiences. When I lived in Columbia, Missouri, we were the only white church in town we were predominantly white. There was a predominantly black church in the same denomination in the black neighborhood. We did joint worship together sometimes. That helped. And when I lived here, the church, in Minnesota, the church that was LGBTQI did annual worship with an all nations church, was Native American, which is how I got to know Native American communities in the Twin Cities also. You just have to sort of step out of your comfort zone and go into it. It's an effort. It's like when you go to a foreign country, you have to sort of figure out the body language and the languaging and all of that. And it's that way with different subcultures. So anyway, I know that's not an answer to your question, but I know what you mean about that fear factor. Where you're walking down the street, people move further away. Yeah.
Should we take one more question and then wrap it up, because it's 3 o'clock and
there's somebody there
afterwards for informal
Okay.
conversation.
Yeah.
I have a question for those doing work in the church, in particular, which is about faith formation. If we're building a kind of Christianity that's resistant to empire, what does that look like? How are we forming people in the community for that kind of witness to Christian life? What is required?
I am now convinced, at least in the U.S., that the biggest failure of Protestantism is not to take ritual seriously. Because of the, Catholic superstition and the indulgences and all that sort of stuff, Protestants became reactionaries against ritual. And that's why I think the Eucharist was such a flashpoint in the Protestant Reformation, because that was the main ritual that was really powerful. And I actually think faith formation happens through ritual. And I think the biggest mistake that Protestant churches made about 30 or 40 years ago was they were into liturgical renewal. Finally, they maybe thought they should do ritual better. So they started doing that, but in doing that, they subtracted the children out with a special little thing for them, and then they often left the service to go do children's church, which means that they didn't have the church adult ritual in their bodies and bones. And so they go off to college and not come back to church because they didn't miss it. They just didn't miss it. I think it's ritual that really is the formation process. And I'm more and more convinced of that from work by Tanya Lohrmann, this anthropologist. She actually says these invisible ideas, these ideologies we call religion, don't live in people's bodies unless you do it ritually. And she grew up Unitarian. She was studying to be a psychiatrist. She got interested in the split in psychology between the drug psychiatrists and the analytic psychiatrists that use talk therapy, because some people do both, but it's a total split in the psychiatric community. So she wrote this book called Of Two Minds, which is about that split. But then she decided she's a participant observer, so she was studying psychiatry and wrote that book. So then she decided to come to London and study Druids. Okay? So she's studying Druids, and she said 2 months after, and as a participant observer, she started going to their rituals. So she was deep in the community, and about 2 months into her time in London, one day she kind of half awake, was lying in bed, and she looked the window out her room, and she saw a group of Druids standing outside her window. And she closed her eyes and looked again, and they were gone. She said, "How did I see that?" Well, because she was immersed in the ritual process, and somehow they were in her body system. And so her book is called How God Becomes Real. And she says if you don't keep doing the ritual, the stuff starts to fade away. So whatever you do with children, make it a ritual. So it repeats, and it gets in their body automatically. Because once you do ritual enough, you can do one gesture and it will call up the whole thing. So like when we got arrested, 100 of us at the airport, we decided to make a long line after we closed the airport, and we were facing the people on the sidewalk who weren't going to get arrested and singing and doing things. And when the police showed up behind us to arrest us, we all knelt down we had pads, thank goodness, on our knees, and it was a frozen ground. And we started reciting the Lord's Prayer over and over. We all knew what that was. We didn't have to read it. And it was really powerful. And I don't even like the non-inclusive version of the Lord's Prayer, but that's what we were praying, but it was really powerful. There's just something emotional about that, because we all knew it. It's deep in us. So ritual. And there's a wonder, if you're interested in one of the best books I've read on ritual is Ritual and Its Consequences, which is a cross-cultural historical look at the meaning of ritual and what it does, written in one voice by, I think, 4 or 5 authors. And they're all different specialists. One's a psychiatrist, one's an historian of religions, one's a Chinese history expert, and they wrote this book together on ritual. It's amazing. And their main thing, and this is really fascinating, their main thing is ritual changes people because it has a structure, beginning, middle, and end. And you know when you go into it that you're entering a different liminal space that's not ordinary time and space. And it can be a bedside where a chaplain prays with someone. That's a ritual. It can be church. All kinds of forms of ritual. But when you do a good side ritual like communion or something, you enter into it and you hear stories and you empathize and you connect to people in ways that suspend your personal authenticity. Like if you hear a story, you read a scripture, somebody preaches a sermon, you enter an imaginary space that may not be actually how you're feeling. And through this beginning, middle, and end of a ritual process, you can be dramatically changed, but you didn't have to do it yourself. It's not like therapy where you have to change yourself. A ritual does it for you. And that's the magic of a ritual. We created, for the veterans that with moral injury at Volunteers of America, we created a structure like that runs 50 hours over 5 days. And invariably, at the end of that process, we'll have a veteran say, I don't know how you did it, but I feel so much better. And we had one that said, I've been under psychiatric care for 27 years, and they couldn't do what you did in 5 days. I feel like myself again. But there's a way that your own authentic mess gets sort of set aside in a ritual and you can carry it through, but somehow it gets changed by the ritual process. So ritual is really quite potent if it's good. There's a lot of bad ritual too. It's not that ritual can be awful. But when it's good and helpful, it really does help people change without them having to do the effort themselves, because it connects them to others as well. So, you Anglicans know that better than us American Protestants.
Better than the youth. So we'd like to thank all of you for coming and being a part of this afternoon with Rita, and a very big thank you to Rita for her